The sheriff did not come to arrest me. He came carrying a lie in a brown envelope, and the woman who sent it stood behind my iron gate, smiling like she had already watched my home fall. It was late afternoon at Ashford Manor, right after a hard May rain, the kind that left the stone steps shining black and made the boxwood smell sharp and clean along the drive. I was on the front porch checking the copper gutter above the columns when I heard tires crunch slowly over the wet gravel. Down the hill, past the lion statues my father used to joke were uglier than unpaid taxes, a sheriff's department cruiser rolled through the open gate, with a black sedan behind it, and a white luxury sport utility vehicle creeping in last. I knew the white vehicle before it stopped. Victoria Langley, president of Ridgeview Estates Homeowners Association, never arrived anywhere without making sure people saw her arrive. She stepped out beneath the dripping oak trees in a cream raincoat, tablet tucked under one arm, her gray blonde hair perfect despite the weather, and looked up at my house like it was a problem she had finally solved. Deputy Carl Benson got out of the cruiser first. He was calm, polite, and careful, the way civil deputies are when they know an envelope can make people hear things that are not actually written inside. "Mr. Ashford?" he asked. "Warren Ashford," I said, walking down the porch steps. My boots clicked against wet stone. Behind me, the brass lion door knocker on the front door caught the last strip of sunlight, polished gold against dark oak. My father had cleaned that knocker every Sunday morning, even when he was too sick to climb the north stairs without stopping. He said a house with history deserved one honest shine facing the road. Deputy Benson handed me the packet. "I am serving civil documents on behalf of Ridgeview Estates Homeowners Association. I am not here to enforce demolition, collect payment, or remove property." That sentence mattered. Victoria's smile flickered for half a second because she had hoped I would not hear the difference. I opened the envelope under the porch light. The top page had Ridgeview letterhead, a lawyer's signature, and one line bold enough to be a threat. "Pay within 72 hours or remove non-compliant mansion structures." Below it, Ashford Manor was described as an unsafe relic, an unauthorized visual obstruction, and a structure damaging community property values. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because Ashford Manor had stood on that hill since 1912, long before Ridgeview Estates carved cul-de-sacs and artificial lakes into land my family once sold piece by piece. My deed was separate. My taxes were separate. My restoration permits were county approved. My historic exemption had more signatures than Victoria had committees. She moved closer to the gate, lifting her voice just enough for the black sedan driver to hear. "This could have been avoided, Warren. The board gave you every opportunity to comply." Rainwater dripped from the iron spikes between us. I looked from her tablet to the packet, then back to Deputy Benson. "Deputy, just to be clear, this is service of civil paperwork, not a court order." "Correct," he said. "No court order for demolition is attached." Victoria's jaw tightened. There it was, the first hairline crack in the polished stone of her authority. I touched the brass lion knocker behind me with 2 fingers, feeling the cold metal my father had kept bright and kept my voice even. "Then somebody used your badge as decoration for a threat." Deputy Benson did not smile, but his eyes shifted toward Victoria just long enough to tell me he understood. What she did not know, what nobody standing in that wet driveway knew, was that before I restored old houses for a living, I spent 12 years as a county land use attorney. I knew the difference between a notice and an order. I knew the difference between a sheriff's envelope and a judge's signature. And most importantly, I knew that the mansion Victoria Langley lived in at the bottom of the hill was sitting on a boundary line she had been praying nobody would ever measure again. I waited until Deputy Benson drove away before I said another word to Victoria, because timing is everything when someone tries to turn paperwork into theater. The cruiser rolled down the gravel drive, its tires hissing through shallow puddles, and the black sedan followed, leaving her white sport utility vehicle alone beneath the oak trees. She stayed outside the iron gate, tablet against her chest, watching me hold the packet like it was supposed to feel heavier than my deed. "You have 72 hours, she said. The association attorney was very clear. I looked at the wet letterhead again, at the bold sentence meant to sound like a wrecking ball, and then at the brass lion knocker on my front door. My father had touched that same metal every Sunday, polishing around the mane with an old cotton rag until the lion looked awake. Ashford Manor was not just square footage on a hill. It was limestone walls, slate roof, carved stair rails, original library windows, and a front hall where my mother used to set lilacs in a blue vase every spring. It was a house that had survived 2 recessions, 1 lightning strike, 3 bad contractors, and every new resident who moved into Ridgeview Estates believing the hill behind their subdivision was part of the view they purchased. It was never part of their association. Ridgeview bought lower acreage from my family in the 1980s, a clean development sale that carved out streets, lots, an artificial lake, and common landscaping. But the contract retained Ashford Manor, the North Service Road, the drainage corridor, and a slope stabilization strip running along the waterline. I knew because I had reviewed the old files after my father died, and because land use law had been my profession before restoration became my peace. "Victoria," I said, "where is the court order?" Her eyes narrowed. "Do not play legal games with me. That is exactly what I am trying to avoid." She stepped closer to the gate, heels pressing into damp gravel. "Your mansion is a nuisance. It is outdated, unapproved, and incompatible with Ridgeview's architectural standards. Ridgeview has no architectural control over this parcel. Your property affects our values." Effect is not jurisdiction. For the first time, she stopped smiling completely. The rain had left dark streaks on the stone pillars beside the gate, and the smell of wet boxwood and old mortar sat between us. She lifted her tablet and tapped the screen. "The community will see that the sheriff delivered final notice today." I almost thanked her for saying it out loud. Instead, I took out my phone and started recording. "Repeat that, please." She froze. "You heard me. I heard you misrepresent civil service as enforcement." The deputy was very clear. He served papers. He did not issue an order. He did not authorize demolition. He did not collect a fine. A curtain moved in the black sedan parked farther down the drive. Someone was still watching. Victoria noticed too and lowered her voice. "You should be careful, Warren. Old houses have old problems." I folded the packet once, slid it under my arm, and walked back toward the porch. And old property records have long memories. Inside, the manor smelled like rain-soaked wool, lemon oil, and cold fireplace ash. I placed the packet on the library table beneath my father's framed survey map and called my sister Mara. She answered from the county archive room where she volunteered 2 days a week, her voice echoing softly. "Tell me you are not calling because Victoria finally did something stupid." She sent a sheriff's deputy with a pay-or-remove packet. Mara went silent just long enough for me to hear paper rustle on her end. "Open the Ashford retained lands file," she said. "The blue box. Top shelf." I pulled it last month because her west terrace looked wrong on the aerial map. I looked through the library window down the hill, past the wet lawn and iron gate, toward the glow of Victoria's mansion beside the artificial lake. Its west wing stretched toward the dark tree line, elegant, expensive, and much too close to land my family never sold. The envelope on my table had been meant to scare me into defending my house. Instead, it had reminded me exactly where to look at hers. I found the blue box in the library closet behind 3 rolled restoration plans and a stack of old tax ledgers that smelled like dust, ink, and the cedar shelves my father built when I was 15. The label on the front was written in his blocky handwriting. Ashford Retained Lands, Service Road. Drainage Corridor, Ridgeview Sale. That box had sat in my house longer than Victoria Langley had been president of anything. And when I lifted the lid, I felt the strange calm that comes when a threat finally meets paper older than the threat itself. Mara stayed on the phone while I spread the documents across the library table beneath the brass lamp. The civil packet from Ridgeview lay on one side, all sharp language and borrowed authority. My family records covered the rest of the table like a quiet army. The original 1986 sale contract, the retained parcel description, the slope stabilization easement, the drainage corridor map, historic structure exemption, county restoration permits, inspection approvals, and a survey stamped long before Ridgeview's artificial lake had its decorative fountain. "Read the retained boundary clause," Mara said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear pages moving around her at the archive. I found the clause and read it aloud. "The seller retains all rights, title, and interest in the North Hill parcel, manor grounds, service road, and drainage corridor as shown on Exhibit C." I unfolded Exhibit C, and the old paper cracked softly under my fingers. The line ran from the stone culvert below my east lawn, down the slope, around the service road, and along the narrow strip behind what was now Victoria's lakefront mansion. Then I saw it. Her west wing, grand terrace, and curved driveway were not just close to the retained line. They crossed it, not by inches, by enough that a survey stake could embarrass an architect. I stood there in the library with rain tapping the windows and looked down the hill at the glow from her windows. That was when my phone buzzed. Ridgeview Estates had sent a community email. The subject line read "Final Notice Delivered to Ashford Manor." I opened it and watched Victoria turn the sheriff's visit into a performance. She wrote that the board had taken formal action to protect residents from unsafe structures and preserve community values. She wrote that county involvement had begun. She wrote that Ashford Manor had 72 hours to comply. She did not write that Deputy Benson had said he was only serving civil documents. She did not write that no court order existed. She did not write that my property was outside the association. Mara heard my silence and said, "She sent something, did she not? To the whole community. Save it, print it, forward it to Grace." Grace Miller was my attorney, and unlike Victoria's board counsel, Grace knew the difference between intimidation and evidence. I forwarded everything, then called Deputy Benson and asked one question for the record. "Deputy, did you deliver any demolition order today?" His answer was immediate. "No, sir. Civil service only." "Did you tell Ridgeview they had enforcement authority over my property?" "No, sir." "Thank you." I wrote both answers down by hand because I wanted the motion of the pen to slow me down. Victoria wanted me emotional. She wanted me defending stone walls while she hid the glass foundation under her own. I had seen this pattern in land use hearings for 12 years. Make the other side look unreasonable, wrap private ambition in public concern, rush the timeline, hope nobody reads the exhibits until the damage feels inevitable. But Ashford Manor was not inevitable damage. It was permitted, inspected, exempted, and recorded. I called Dean Price, the surveyor my father trusted before he retired. Dean answered from a truck cab with wind noise in the background. "Warren, if this is about Ridgeview," I wondered when they would finally step on the wrong line. "Can you be here tomorrow morning?" "With stakes and a crew." I looked again at Victoria's glowing west wing below the hill, elegant against the wet trees, and placed my hand on the brass lion knocker beside the open front door. "Bring orange flags," I said. "Enough for a mansion." Dean Price arrived at 7:40 the next morning with 2 survey trucks, 3 crew members, a tripod, a total station, and a bundle of orange stakes that looked almost bright enough to glow against the wet grass. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving Ashford Manor washed clean on the hill, every limestone block pale under the morning sun. I was on the porch with coffee in one hand and the blue retained lands folder under my arm when Dean stepped out, pulled on a faded canvas vest, and looked down toward Ridgeview's artificial lake. "Your father hated vague lines," he said without hello. He said vague lines were where expensive arguments grew. He was right. Dean nodded toward the brass lion knocker on my front door. He would have polished that before a survey. He did every Sunday. That was all we said about Dad before the work began, because men like Dean respected grief by doing the job correctly. Mara arrived 10 minutes later with archive copies sealed in a flat case, and Grace Miller joined by phone from her office, listening while Dean matched the old Exhibit C description to county coordinates, subdivision plats, and the modern parcel data Ridgeview had been pretending did not exist. I stayed back as the crew moved down the slope, past the service road, past the stone culvert, into the strip of land my family had retained when Ridgeview was sold. The first stake went into the grass beside the drainage channel. The second landed near the curve of Victoria's driveway. The third went beside her imported stone terrace, less than 3 feet from a row of manicured boxwoods. By the time the fifth stake went in, residents had started appearing on porches and sidewalks with coffee cups and phones held low. Victoria's mansion sat glossy and white beside the lake, its west wing stretching toward my hill like it had been reaching for my land for years. Dean's crew kept working. The orange line continued across the edge of the terrace, along a retaining wall, and under the shadow of a second-floor balcony. When Dean placed a stake near the foundation corner, Victoria came out through glass doors in a pale blue blouse and slacks, moving fast enough to show she had been watching. "What do you think you are doing?" she called across the lawn. I stayed on my side of the marked corridor and let Dean answer because surveyors do not sound dramatic when they ruin someone's morning. Locating a recorded retained boundary. This is private property. Dean looked at his tablet, then at the orange stake beside her terrace. That is the issue. Grace's voice came through my phone, calm and clear. Warren, keep recording. Do not debate her. I lifted my phone slightly. Victoria saw it and straightened. This is harassment. The board has already taken action against your non-compliant structure. I held up the sheriff packet from the day before. Civil paperwork is not a court order. Dean pointed toward the line of stakes. And landscaping is not a boundary marker. A small crowd had gathered near the sidewalk now. Someone whispered, "Are those on her property?" Another voice said, "I thought that whole strip belonged to Ridgeview." Mara opened the blue folder and handed Dean the old sale contract, the retained lands exhibit, and the drainage corridor map. Dean compared them to his equipment, then drove a taller stake near the corner of Victoria's west wing. The mallet made a hollow thump that echoed off her terrace stone. Victoria's face changed then, not with surprise, but recognition. That was the part one caught. Not confusion. Recognition. She knew the line. She had always known the line. At 9:32, Dean handed me a preliminary survey note and said, "The west terrace, part of the driveway curve, and a portion of that wing appear to encroach onto retained Ashford land and the protected drainage corridor. I will finalize the stamped report today." Victoria took one step back toward her glass doors. "You cannot just put stakes wherever you want." Dean's expression did not move. "No, ma'am. That is why we measure." I looked from the orange flags to the packet she had sent against my home, and for the first time since Deputy Benson handed me that envelope, the shape of her plan stood in full daylight. She had tried to make Ashford Manor look like the violation because her own mansion was standing on one. By noon, the orange stakes had become the loudest thing in Ridgeview Estates, and they did not make a sound. They stood in wet grass, beside imported stone, along Victoria Langley's curved driveway, and under the west balcony of her mansion like bright little witnesses refusing to move. Dean Price left after promising a stamped report by the end of the day, but the neighborhood did not go back to normal. Residents slowed their cars near the artificial lake. Lawn crews worked quietly. Curtains shifted. Victoria's public email about Ashford Manor had trained everyone to look uphill at my house, and now the stakes had forced their eyes downhill toward hers. That was when Grace Miller told me to expect the next layer. People who build over a line usually leave a paper trail, she said over the phone while Mara and I spread fresh copies of the survey photos across the library table. Contractors ask questions. Engineers make notes. Somebody warned her before concrete was poured. She was right. At 2:16, a man named Miles Redding called my office at Ashford Restoration and Demolition, not my house. That detail mattered because he knew exactly who I was. Miles had built the West Wing addition to Victoria's mansion 4 years earlier, back when I was still taking county restoration cases and before I inherited full control of the company. His voice carried that careful strain of a contractor trying to step out from under somebody else's bad decision without sounding like he was running. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "I saw survey stakes at the Langley property this morning. So did half the neighborhood. I need to send you something." I kept records because the layout changed after my site supervisor raised a boundary concern. I looked at Mara. She was already reaching for the printer tray. "Send everything to my attorney." Miles hesitated. I should have pushed harder back then. "Send it to Grace," I said. "Then tell the truth in writing." The email arrived 9 minutes later. Work orders. Foundation layout notes. A site photograph with string lines. An engineer's comment about the retained Ashford drainage corridor. Then the message from Miles to Victoria, dated 4 years earlier. West Foundation corner appears to cross retained Ashford parcel line and drainage setback. Recommend revised plan before pour. Under it was Victoria's reply. Proceed as drawn. Once the structure is complete, the association can pressure him to release the strip. Mara stopped breathing for a second. The old manor was silent around us, except for the ticking library clock and rainwater still dropping from the gutters. Outside, I read the sentence again, slower, because sometimes corruption has to be looked at twice before the mind accepts how plain it is. She had not attacked Ashford Manor because it was unsafe. She had attacked it because it was inconvenient proof that I still owned what she needed. Grace came on the line 5 minutes later, and the tone in her voice had changed from cautious to surgical. "We are moving for emergency injunctive relief. I am notifying county code enforcement, drainage control, and the sheriff's civil office. Do not contact Victoria directly. Do not respond to Ridgeview's attorney except through me. Preserve every message. By late afternoon, County Inspector Paul Hargrove was walking the staked corridor with Dean's preliminary survey in one hand and a tablet in the other. He checked the drainage channel, the retaining wall, the west foundation, the terrace supports, and the slope behind the artificial lake. Victoria watched from behind her glass doors until Paul knocked and asked for permit records for the West Wing addition. She came outside with a folder too thin for a house that large. Paul flipped through it under the gray sky, then looked toward the orange stakes. This permit package does not show construction inside the drainage corridor. Victoria said, that area was always understood to be part of Ridgeview Common Planning. Paul looked at me, then back at her. Understanding is not a permit. He posted a yellow stop-use notice on the terrace door before sunset. Not on my manor. On hers. The same residents who had been told my house had 72 hours to comply now stood along the sidewalk watching county tape flutter beside Victoria's imported stone. I stood at the top of the hill near Ashford Manor, the brass lion knocker behind me catching a weak strip of evening light, and felt the story turn. Her threat had arrived in a sheriff envelope. Her truth arrived on contractor letterhead. Grace filed the emergency petition before the courthouse clerk closed, and by 5:48 that evening, the case stopped being a neighborhood argument and became a matter of recorded land, code compliance, and a structure standing where the record said it did not belong. I watched the first stamped copy come through my email while standing in Ashford Manor's library, the brass lamp glowing over Dean Price's preliminary survey, Miles Redding's email, Paul Hargrove's stop-use notice, the Ridgeview civil packet, and Victoria's public message about my supposedly unsafe home. Mara had arranged everything in a timeline across the table, each document placed like a stepping stone through the lie. First, the old sale contract. Then the retained land map. Then the West Wing construction warning. Then Victoria's answer to proceed anyway. Then her threat against me. It looked simple when the paper was honest. She had built across the line, then tried to make my house the problem before I looked down the hill. Grace called just after 6. Her voice was calm, but there was motion behind it. Office phones, printer trays, another attorney reading pages nearby. The judge signed temporary relief against further use of the encroaching portion pending tomorrow's hearing. County Code Enforcement is expanding the review. The Sheriff's Civil Office will post the order tonight. Do not approach the Langley property unless you are with officials. I looked through the rain-streaked window toward the lake. Victoria's mansion was lit beautifully, West Wing glowing warm behind glass, terrace lights reflecting off the artificial water, yellow county notice still taped near the door like a small warning on a very expensive mistake. What about the 72-hour threat against Ashford Manor? I asked. Ridgeview's counsel is already walking that back, Grace said. They are calling it an aggressive settlement demand. Mara snorted softly from across the table. Grace heard it and continued, which is why we are not letting them rewrite it. The email to residents, the sheriff packet, and Deputy Benson's clarification are all in the record. At 7:15, Deputy Benson returned to Ridgeview Estates, not to my gate this time, but to Victoria's. Paul Hargrove met him beside the curved driveway, and Dean Price arrived with his final stamped survey still warm from the printer. I stayed on the public side of the service road, with Mara, Grace on speakerphone, and my own phone recording from a distance. The same residents who had watched my supposed final notice unfold now stood in quiet clusters near the sidewalk, their faces lit by porch lights and phone screens. Deputy Benson posted the court notice on Victoria's west entry. Paul posted an expanded county notice at the terrace steps. Dean pointed out the marked encroachment line, orange stakes running past imported stone, and under the balcony that had been sold to the neighborhood as proof of Ridgeview elegance. Victoria opened the door before they finished. She looked at the papers, then at me across the service road, and for once she did not perform for the crowd. You brought a demolition company into this, she called. That was true, but not the way she wanted people to hear it. Ashford Restoration and Demolition was my company, licensed, insured, bonded, and boring in exactly the way legal work should be boring. My equipment yard had 2 excavators, 1 compact bulldozer, roll-off containers, safety fencing, and operators who did not move a bucket without a permit number, utility clearance, and a written scope. No crew touches anything without court authority, county approval, and a cleared structure, I said. That is how lawful demolition works. Deputy Benson turned slightly toward the residents. There is no authorization for private action tonight. This is posting and preservation. I appreciated him saying it because Victoria had built her power from making words sound like weapons. That night, words had to be precise. Still, at 9:30, under temporary work lights in my own equipment yard, I had my crew stage the machinery. Not at her house, not past the marked line, just lined up behind the locked fence of Ashford Restoration, with permit folders on the dashboard, safety cones stacked neatly, and a job board marked pending court order. The compact bulldozer sat under the lights, quiet, clean, and still. Mara stood beside me in the cold night air and looked at it, then back toward the distant glow of Ridgeview. She wanted people to imagine your manor coming down, she said. I touched the brass lion keychain in my pocket, the one my father had carried before the house became mine. Then tomorrow, I said, we let the records decide which walls were really built on a lie. The hearing lasted 41 minutes, which was almost insulting when I thought about how many years Victoria had spent building her confidence on the wrong side of a line. I sat beside Grace Miller at the county courthouse while Mara kept the blue retained lands file open on her lap, each tab marked in yellow, each copy stamped, each exhibit clean enough to speak for itself. Victoria came with Ridgeview's board counsel, 2 board members, and the same polished expression she wore whenever she expected procedure to bend around her. It did not. The judge began with the simple question every false authority hates. Where is the recorded right allowing the association to demand removal of structures on Ashford Manor? Ridgeview's attorney talked about community impact, property values, architectural consistency, and safety concerns. Grace waited until he ran out of air, then placed Deputy Benson's written clarification on the table. Civil service only. No enforcement order. No demolition authority. No court judgment. The judge read it once and looked over his glasses. A sheriff's delivery does not convert a private demand into a court order. I felt Mara's hand tighten around the file folder, not in anger, but relief. Then Grace moved to the lower property. Dean Price testified first by affidavit and survey, his stamped map projected on the courtroom screen. The orange line crossed Victoria's west terrace, driveway curve, and part of the west wing like a bright scar over expensive stone. Paul Hargrove followed with the county findings. Unpermitted expansion into the protected drainage corridor, missing revised site plan, improper encroachment into retained land, and stop-use notice pending corrective action. Then Grace showed Miles Redding's email. West Foundation corner appears to cross retained Ashford parcel line and drainage setback. Recommend revised plan before pour. The reply from Victoria appeared beneath it. Proceed as drawn. Once the structure is complete, the association can pressure him to release the strip. The courtroom went still in that particular way legal rooms get still when intent stops hiding behind interpretation. Victoria did not look at the screen. She looked at the table in front of her, both hands folded, pearl bracelet resting against a stack of papers that suddenly had no weight at all. The judge did not order anything dramatic that morning. Real justice rarely sounds dramatic at first. He extended the stop-use order, barred Ridgeview from enforcing any removal demand against Ashford Manor without further court approval, required preservation of all association communications, and authorized county-supervised abatement planning for the encroaching portion if no immediate lawful resolution was reached. He also ordered Victoria and Ridgeview to produce all board records related to the civil packet, resident email, West Wing construction, and any use of association funds tied to the dispute. Outside the courthouse, reporters were not waiting. There was no crowd, no music, no thunder. Just wet sidewalks, traffic hissing by, and Victoria walking past me without meeting my eyes. Her attorney murmured something about settlement discussions. Grace answered before I could. Written proposals only. By afternoon, the production order had done what pressure never could. Eleanor Finch, Ridgeview's treasurer, came to Ashford Manor with a banker's box and a face full of regret. She had lived in Ridgeview for 11 years and had believed, like most residents, that Victoria was protecting the association from outside problems. I did not know the West Wing crossed your land, she said in my library, setting the box on the table beneath the brass lamp. but I did see legal invoices coded as Architectural Enforcement Reserve. I thought they were for covenant review. Mara opened the first folder. Inside were invoices from Ridgeview's attorney, public relations drafts about Ashford Manor, and board notes discussing pressure strategy. One note read, "Leverage sheriff service to increase urgency before Ashford challenges boundary." Another said, "Avoid discussing Langley encroachment in open session." Eleanor covered her mouth, then lowered her hand and forced herself to keep speaking. "There are dues behind this," she said. Residents paid for her cover story. I looked out the library window toward the hill, where the brass lion knocker shone on my front door, and the manor stood exactly where the 1912 foundation had always stood. Down below, the orange stakes still surrounded the part of Victoria's mansion that was never supposed to be there. She had sent a deputy to make my house look doomed. By sunset, her own board records had become the machinery warming up at the edge of the truth. By the next evening, Ridgeview Estates called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, and this time the room did not belong to Victoria, no matter where she sat. The clubhouse was built to look expensive without ever feeling permanent. All beige stone veneer, polished floor tile, lakeview windows, and a gas fireplace nobody used because the air conditioning was always too cold. Residents filled every chair. Some stood along the walls with folded arms and due statements in their hands. The projector hummed against the back wall, and the smell of burnt coffee drifted from a silver urn near the sign-in table. I walked in with Grace on one side and Mara on the other, carrying nothing but my father's brass lion keychain and the calm that comes when the documents are already stronger than your voice. Victoria sat at the board table in a navy blazer, her tablet flat in front of her, her expression arranged into something between patience and injury. She looked like a woman waiting for the room to remember she was in charge. It did not. Grace began with the civil packet, the one delivered to my porch under the weight of a sheriff's envelope. She projected the bold line about payment and removal, then Deputy Benson's clarification beneath it. Civil service only. No enforcement order. No demolition authority. No court judgment. A murmur moved through the room, low and embarrassed, because many of those residents had forwarded Victoria's email and believed Ashford Manor was days from being legally condemned. Then Grace showed my deed, historic exemption, restoration permits, tax records, and the county inspection approvals. Ashford Manor, the old stone house they had been taught to see as a problem, stood outside Ridgeview Control as clearly on paper as it stood on the hill. Victoria reached for her microphone. The board acted to protect community values. Grace clicked once, and Dean Price's stamped survey filled the wall. Orange boundary lines crossed Victoria's west terrace, driveway curve, and a portion of her west wing. The board president's personal residence is the structure currently under stop-use order, Grace said. Not Mr. Ashford's. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of people recalculating every newsletter, every warning, every sentence Victoria had delivered with confidence. Paul Hargrove's county report came next. Unpermitted expansion, missing revised site plan, protected drainage corridor, corrective action required. Then Miles Redding's email appeared, the contractor warning about the boundary problem, followed by Victoria's reply telling him to proceed and let association pressure solve it later. A woman in the third row whispered, she knew. Eleanor Finch stood near the front with the banker's box she had brought to my library, her hands tight around a folder. Grace asked whether association money had been used for legal pressure connected to my property. Eleanor's voice shook, but she answered clearly. Yes. Invoices were coded through Architectural Enforcement Reserve. Residents were not told the dispute involved an encroachment connected to the president's private residence. That was when the meeting stopped being about me. People turned toward the board table, not angry in a loud way, but focused, betrayed, suddenly aware that their dues had been used to polish the wrong lie. A man asked who approved the attorney letter. Another asked why the Langley encroachment had been kept out of open session. Someone else asked whether Ridgeview's insurance had been notified. Victoria finally spoke, her voice thin under the fluorescent lights. This is being exaggerated by a homeowner with a grudge. I took the brass lion keychain from my pocket and placed it on the table where the projector light touched it. My grudge did not move your foundation. I said, my grudge did not write that email. My grudge did not send a sheriff to my porch with a threat dressed like an order. Grace closed her binder and gave the board the terms. Withdraw every claim against Ashford Manor. Reimburse legal fees and survey costs. Correct the community email. Preserve all records. Cooperate with county abatement. And remove Victoria from any role involving enforcement decisions. Outside the clubhouse windows, the artificial lake reflected the lights from her mansion, including the darkened west wing under county notice. For years, she had used that glow to look untouchable. That night, every resident in the room could finally see the orange stakes behind it. The board accepted Grace's terms in principle before midnight, but Victoria did what people like her always do when the walls start closing in on paper. She tried to rename surrender as leadership. At 7:14 the next morning, Ridgeview residents received a new email saying the board had initiated a comprehensive boundary review to resolve a historic mapping discrepancy, and that all enforcement matters involving Ashford Manor were temporarily paused as a gesture of neighborly cooperation. Temporarily paused. Mapping discrepancy. Neighborly cooperation. I read it in the library while morning sun spread across the stone floor and the brass lion knocker on the front door threw a small gold reflection onto the wall. Mara stood beside me with coffee in one hand and Eleanor Finch's banker's box open on the table. She is still trying to make this sound mutual, Mara said. Then we keep using words she cannot soften, I said. Grace did exactly that. By 10, she filed the clubhouse presentation, Deputy Benson's clarification, Dean Price's stamped survey, Paul Hargrove's county report, Miles Redding's warning email, Eleanor's budget records, and Victoria's resident messages into the court record. By noon, Ridgeview's insurance carrier had been notified. By 2, the management company suspended enforcement activity tied to Victoria's office. By 4, 3 board members requested an executive session without her present. The artificial lake below Ashford Manor looked calm from my porch, but down there the whole neighborhood was finally moving beneath the surface. The next morning, the corrected notice went out. Not from Victoria. From Ridgeview's acting secretary. It stated that Ashford Manor was not subject to association architectural control, that the prior communication implying sheriff enforcement had been inaccurate, that no demolition order existed against my property, and that the association would reimburse my survey, legal, and documentation costs. The notice also confirmed that a portion of the Langley residence was under county review for encroachment and unpermitted construction within a protected drainage corridor. That sentence landed like a clean hammer strike. People who had avoided looking at me on the road now waved awkwardly from their driveways. One man stopped near my gate and said, "We were told you were refusing to fix a dangerous structure." I looked back at Ashford Manor, its limestone walls warm in the sun, its slate roof clean after the rain. That was the point, I said. If everyone looked at my house, nobody looked at hers. On the third day, Grace received the abatement plan. Victoria had 2 choices: negotiate a permanent recorded land transfer and drainage reconstruction plan at a price I did not have to accept, or remove the encroaching west terrace, driveway curve, and unsupported portion of the west wing under county supervision. She tried the first option through her attorney, offering what she called fair market value for the strip. Grace read the offer over the phone and laughed once. She wants to buy the evidence after using your own land as leverage against you. I declined, not because I wanted spectacle, because that corridor carried stormwater from the hill to the lake. It stabilized a slope my father had protected, and once you let someone purchase the line they crossed on purpose, every future line becomes a suggestion. County agreed. Paul Hargrove issued the corrective order. The structure had to be cleared, utilities disconnected only under permit, salvage removed, safety fencing installed, and the illegal encroaching section dismantled by a licensed crew. My company won the work. Only after Victoria's carrier requested bids and 2 other contractors refused to touch a job tangled in litigation. Grace made sure every approval was in writing before I allowed a single machine near that property. No one lived in the west wing. Furniture was removed. Utilities were marked. Windows were boarded from the outside. Safety fencing went up along the orange stakes. Deputy Benson stood by for civil documentation, not enforcement theater. Paul Hargrove inspected the perimeter. Dean Price confirmed the cut line. At dusk, my compact bulldozer rolled from the staging area with headlights glowing low over the wet pavement, slow as a verdict, while Ashford Manor stood untouched on the hill behind me. Victoria watched from the main lawn of her mansion, wrapped in a pale coat, no tablet in sight. For the first time, she was not sending papers to my door. She was watching hers answer mine. The machines did not roar into Victoria's property like revenge. They moved in at walking speed behind safety fencing, permit placards, utility clearance marks, county inspection tags, and a court order printed on white paper that sat in Paul Hargrove's clipboard. That was the part people missed when they imagined justice as noise. Real justice sounded like backup alarms, radio checks, a foreman reading the approved scope, Dean Price confirming the survey line one last time, and Deputy Benson saying for the record that the West Wing was empty, cleared, and posted. I stood beside Grace and Mara on the public side of the work zone while my crew began with the terrace, not the house, removing stone caps, rail sections, and decorative panels piece by piece so nothing shifted toward the drainage corridor. The compact bulldozer waited with its blade lowered, quiet under the work lights, while smaller equipment handled the first cuts. Victoria stood near the main lawn with her arms folded inside a pale coat, watching the imported terrace that had made her mansion look untouchable become numbered salvage on pallets. No one mocked her. No one needed to. The orange stakes did what shouting could not. They showed exactly where confidence had crossed into someone else's land. When the west portion finally came down, it was not a collapse. It was a controlled removal, slow, documented, inspected, and recorded from 3 angles. Paul checked the drainage channel after every stage. Dean checked the exposed boundary. My crew loaded debris into containers labeled by material. The whole job took 2 days, because lawful work takes longer than anger, and I wanted every minute of it clean. By the end of the second afternoon, the illegal terrace was gone, the driveway curve was cut back, the west wing had been reduced to the permitted line, and the drainage corridor breathed open for the first time in years. From the hill, Ashford Manor looked exactly the same as it had before Victoria sent that envelope. Limestone walls washed pale by weather, slate roof catching the sun, brass lion knocker shining on the dark oak door. Ridgeview did not look the same. Victoria resigned before the final inspection report was filed, though the board called it a transition in leadership. The corrected notices went out. My legal fees, survey costs, documentation expenses, and restoration losses were reimbursed. The board adopted a policy requiring recorded authority before any enforcement letter could mention demolition, sheriff's service, structural removal, or legal action against property outside association control. Eleanor Finch became treasurer under an independent audit. Miles Redding gave a sworn statement. Deputy Benson's clarification was attached to every record involving the case. One plain sentence cutting through all of Victoria's theater. Civil service only. A week later, Mara and I stood on Ashford Manor's porch after another rainstorm, the air smelling of wet stone and boxwood again. Down by the lake. Victoria's mansion was smaller now, still expensive, still standing where it was allowed to stand, but no longer reaching into land it never owned. I took an old cotton rag from the hall table and polished the brass lion knocker the way my father had every Sunday. The metal warmed under my hand, brightening until the lion's face caught the evening light. Mara looked down the hill and said, "She wanted people to watch your house come down." I hung the rag on the rail and looked at the manor, the old columns, the restored windows, the gravel drive where the deputy had first handed me that lie in an envelope. "She forgot something," I said. "A sheriff envelope is not a court order. A board title is not ownership. And a mansion built over the line cannot hide behind another mansion's shadow forever." The wind moved through the oaks. The last orange survey stake came out of the ground below, and Ashford Manor stood above Ridgeview exactly where the record said it always had.